And then I do this. All right, I think we're going. So if you're at home, press pause and copy down those focus questions. So here's kind of where we left off, is the French and Indian War had ended, and the British have won. Okay? Now, when a war ends, there's generally a treaty, and that treaty in this case was called what? Yeah, it was called the Treaty of Paris. Okay, so Treaty of Paris, the main, most important thing out of that was what? Yeah, basically France was kicked out of North America, right? So all that remained basically were the British and the Spanish. Okay. Now, after the war ended, this is where we start to really answer that big question that we had. And what was the big question that we have? Yeah? Right. What events led to the Revolutionary War? So here are some of those things. And a few of these we've talked about already. So, number one, the British were no longer seen maybe as protectors of the colonists because the French weren't there. So the colonies sort of didn't feel like they needed the same amount of protection as they did before. So rather than protectors, the colonists started to really notice all of the things that the British were doing that they didn't like. Okay, so that was one. Colonists began to see the British differently. Second, and we talked about this, the fighting actually continued with Native Americans. The Treaty of Paris was signed between the British and the French. The Native Americans were not a part of that treaty, and they continued to fight. One of the big ones was Chief Pontiac and what was known as Pontiac's Rebellion. That lasted for about 3 more years. Okay. What our assignment just was, what we just corrected, was King George had recognized that he didn't want to keep fighting Native Americans, right? They had just fought that big war with the French, and he wanted to be done. The British people wanted to be done fighting, done paying for these wars. So King George looked at the situation and said, why are the Native Americans fighting against us? Well, because they don't want us encroaching on their land. So, if we don't want to fight the Native Americans anymore, maybe at least for the time being, we should stop encroaching on their lands. Then there would be no reason to fight. So, with that in mind, he issued the Proclamation of 1763, which you guys just did that map on. Now, the issue here, and this is something that we'll come back to a bunch in these next couple months, is the colonies, and then later when we become the United States, always super interested, super excited in expanding, wanting to grow bigger, right? Make the colonies bigger, then make the country bigger, take in more land, expand, expand, expand. And that was something the colonists really wanted to be doing. King George told them, you're not allowed to anymore. Based off of your assignment, what did the colonists think of that plan? Yes, Ashley says they didn't like it, and they did not like it. And truth be told, for the most part, they sort of ignored it anyway, but they definitely were not happy that King George told them they can't move west anymore. Right? We're not happy about that. And then the last one, and this is kind of what we're going to start to get into more, this is new now. The British began to raise taxes on the colonies. Prior to the French and Indian War, for the most part, the British government kind of left the colonies alone, right? Why did the British have these colonies? What were they trying to do? Yeah. Okay, so expansion was a part of it, but expansion to ultimately do what? Yeah. Become more powerful, sure. And if you're going to become more powerful, you're going to need lots and lots of what? Money, right? So the British main deal in the colonies was let's make some money here, right? We want to make money. Up until the French and Indian War, the British were making money in the colonies. So they kind of had this idea, like, we kind of just let these guys alone, but we make a ton of money off of it. So let's just sort of keep this thing rolling, right? We're not going to mess with them too much, but we're going to make a ton of money. It's awesome, right? This is a fantastic deal for us. French and Indian War happens, and wars are wildly expensive. The French and Indian War lasted a total of 9 years, and that's 9 years of spending lots and lots and lots and lots of money to fight that war. So at the end of the war, guess who was in debt? The British, right? Had spent a ton of money fighting this war. Now the war is over, and that bill comes due, right? Like now the British government's like, we have to pay all of this money back that we used to fight the war. Now this is the British perspective on this. From their perspective, they fought the French and Indian War to protect who? Yeah, the colonists, right? So the British government says we spent tons and tons and tons of money to protect the colonies. Up to this point, the colonies really have never paid any kind of taxes or anything of any significance. So because we fought this very expensive 9-year war to protect the colonies, now that bill is due, we think the colonists should pay back some of that too. They should be responsible to pay back some of that money, right? We fought the war for them, to protect them, so they need to carry some of the burden of what the war cost. And how do governments raise money from their people? Through taxes. So the British government says, all right, we're going to start passing some taxes on the colonies, right? They got to pay for the war. We fought it for them. They got to pay for some of it. So we're going to do that through taxes. Their first attempt at that was called the Sugar Act of 1764. When did the war, French and Indian War, end? 1763. This act comes into play 1764. So basically right away. War ends, and they're like, all right, we got to pay this stuff back. Colonies, you're going to be responsible for part of that. Here's the Sugar Act of 1764. Okay, that's the British perspective. Now, the colonists, and really you can think of anybody, people today, generally, are they really stoked about paying taxes? No, right? And the colonists absolutely didn't like this one bit. Because remember, before the French and Indian War, British government really didn't mess with the colonies as far as taxes and stuff go. They kind of had the agreement, you make us money, we're going to let you do what you want to do. After the French and Indian War, British government says, we fought to protect you guys need to pay for some of this. And the colonists said, absolutely not, right? You don't get to put taxes on us. And did they ask the colonists if they'd be willing to pay these taxes? No, they didn't. So they just kind of told the colonies, hey, guess what? You guys are going to pay us taxes now. And you don't have any say in it whatsoever. You do what you're told. And the colonies said, we've got a real problem here, right? So lots of protests. The guy who was behind these was a guy named George Grenville, and he passed this or got this Sugar Act passed. And basically, I mean, this is pretty obvious. What was it a tax on? Yeah, sugar, right? Like sugar and molasses and like that kind of thing. And so right away, the colonies were like, nope, started all these protests. They started what was called a boycott, what is called a boycott. What's a boycott? Yeah. Yeah, and what would be the goal of, so this is a tax on sugar and those kinds of things. And so when the colonists then stopped buying those kinds of things, what's the hope? Ashley.
That the taxes on sugar would just stop from their boycott.
Yeah, basically that's the idea behind a boycott is if you're going to charge us taxes on these products, guess what? We're not paying the taxes and we're not buying those products, right? That's basically what a boycott is. And that's what the colonies did to push back against this tax. I got a little video clip here for you about this.
Up until 1764, Britain hadn't interfered much with the way her colonies were run. The government had maintained an informal policy of healthy neglect. As a result, the colonies were somewhat independent and weren't used to being told what to do. But the British government had gone deeply in debt fighting France, and it desperately needed money. So it was decided that the colonies had to help pay for their own defense. To raise this money, Parliament made a new law called the Sugar Act. It required payment of tariff on imported items such as molasses, sugar, wine, and coffee. Tariffs were supposed to be used to regulate trade. However, some Americans realized that the tariffs imposed by the Sugar Act were just a thinly disguised way of getting them to pay new taxes. The tariffs upset a lot of people because the colonies were not allowed to have representatives in Parliament to stand up for their rights. The most outspoken person on the subject was Samuel Adams of Boston, who declared that the Sugar Act was illegal because the right of taxation was a power that should belong only to the people or their elected representatives.
All right, so we get this. If you think about the Revolutionary War, because again, all this is building towards the Revolutionary War. There was some very famous slogan attached to the Revolutionary War, or like the causes of the Revolutionary War, and it had something to do with taxation. And representation. You guys ever heard of this before? No taxation without representation? Yeah. So that was a slogan that came out of this, right? And two guys were initially behind this. One guy named Samuel Adams, who we will actually talk a fair bit about. He kind of plays a big role in the story. Another guy named James Otis, who we won't spend much time on. But these guys together pushed this idea of no taxation without representation, right? Can anybody tell me what that kind of means? Yeah.
Basically, what they're saying is that if you're going to tax us, we want representatives so they can get money too.
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to tax us, we need representatives. Which representatives where? Yeah. In Parliament, exactly right. So the colonies did not have any representatives in Parliament, in British Parliament. It's British Parliament that passes these taxes. So what the colonists are saying is, if we don't have any representation, right? If we don't have a say in this, in government, then you guys can't put taxes on us because we didn't have our say in it. So you can't tax us unless we have representation, and representation means that we have a say. We get to have our voices heard in it. Does that make sense? Okay, we got like a couple minutes here. Stay where you are, but we'll pack her up.